today we're just going to practice solving more polynomials. Today's just kind of like tie the loose ends, do more stuff. We're not really learning anything new today. So it says in ES2 we learned that the degree of the polynomial tells us how many solutions it will have. So what's the degree of this polynomial?
5.
Yeah, it's the largest exponent, right? So how many answers could I have here?
5.
I could have up to 5. Now sometimes they're imaginary. Sometimes we get the same thing twice. So do you remember from when we graphed and a binomial was squared? What happened at that x-intercept?
Fast.
Yeah, remember if it was squared, it bounced and went back up. Remember that? So sometimes, like if I set this equal to 0, really this is x minus 2 times x minus 2, which gives me the same answer twice, x equals 2. That's why our x-intercept is 2. So sometimes we get the same answer twice, but we basically have the opportunity for 5 answers here is what that's saying, okay? So let's go ahead and factor this the way that we practice. So GCF first, what can I factor out? So 2, and they both have at least y cubed, parentheses. So I took the 2 away, I took 3 of the 5 y's away, so how many y's are left? Y squared minus 18 divided by the 2 I took out. 9, no more y's, equals 0. And now, we call this a difference of 2 perfect squares. So one's plus, one's minus. What times what is y squared?
3.
No. Y times y, and then what times what is 9?
3.
Equals 0. Now, we don't typically do this, but really, y cubed is y times y times y, right? So how many factors do I have here? Remember, a factor is anything multiplied together. So we have y plus 3, and y minus 3. We have 5, remember? Just like the degree told us we should have. Now I'm going to erase this because obviously we don't typically break this out. There's a shorter way of doing that. But how do we now solve for the solutions like we've been doing the past 3 weeks? You set each factor equal to 0. So if I set this equal to 0, I get y equals 3, because I had to add over the 3, right? What's this one going to give me? Negative 3. Now instead of breaking this apart into y times y times y, what we can do is we can still just set that equal to 0. Because that's technically a factor. That's something times something else. There's not 3 terms here. It's already factored. And then now we just solve it with algebra 1. So divide by 2, put 0 divided by anything.
0.
Now technically, how do I undo a cube?
Cube root.
You cube root it, but what's the cube root of 0?
0.
Yeah, but we still do get an answer out of this. We get y equals 0. So how many answers did we get here? 3. Really, what just happened is we got 0 3 times, but we don't need to write it 3 times, right? So just write it the 1 time, and then we have our, so how many times did this polynomial cross the x-axis? 3 times.
Oh.
At 0. So it crosses the x-axis at 0, and negative 3, and positive 3. Oh, here's a blast from the past.
Oh, yeah.
This is a positive odd function. So it's going to start at the bottom of the mountain and end at the top of the mountain. And were any of these squared?
No.
No, so it's going to be cross, cross, cross. Remember that? Cool. All right, moving on. Let's go ahead and skip down to number 1. So number 1, it says solve the following equation. So once again, how do I solve a polynomial? Well, we could. Let's factor. There's a couple ways, but usually we factor, right? So this is a difference of squares. So what times what is x to the fourth? Yeah, it's a perfect square because it's x squared times x squared. And what times what is 9? 3 and 3. So today we're just kind of doing the weird scenarios, like the kind of tying up the loose ends and practicing some ones that maybe aren't as pretty as the ones we've done in the past. Now, are either of those perfect squares?
No.
No, so they don't factor any further unless if it's a perfect square. So we still have to solve it, and that doesn't change. Whatever's in there, when it doesn't factor anymore, that's what we set equal to 0. And then we just do our algebra 1 to get x by itself. So if there's a minus 3 on the left, how do I get that over? We add the 3. And then square root both sides. What do you have to remember when you square root anything? Plus or minus the square root of 3. Obviously, there's no dates to problem 3. So that's it. Now on the other side, it's very similar. So we have x squared plus 3 equals 0. So if there's a plus 3 on the left side, how do I get that over? We minus it. We square root both sides. Uh-oh. First of all, plus or minus. But we have a negative under the radical. So what's the only difference here?
One's the solution, one's not.
Well, how does this simplify?
I.
Plus or minus I square root of 3. So remember the negative is just I. So the negative comes out front as an I. So to summarize, how many answers did we get?
2.
How many total answers did we get?
2.
How many total answers did we get? 4. Plus or minus the square root of 3. Plus or minus I squared of 3. So what was our degree again?
4.
Yeah, so we got 4 answers. But how many of them were real?
2.
Yeah, only the positive one, the plus or minus the positive square root of 3 was real. How many were imaginary?
2.
2. So how many times does this polynomial actually cross the x-axis?
2.
The 2 real times. Okay. Imaginary means it doesn't cross the x-axis. That's what algebra is telling us. So we got answers, and we've practiced I, but they're not real answers, so there's no real x-intercepts there. Okay? And now the last one I'm going to do with you is number 2, and I'm going to have you do 3 and 4 on your own. So, how would I factor? Now, 2 is not equal to 0 yet. And we know we can't factor unless it's equal to 0. So go ahead and subtract over the 9 equals 0. Now, how do we always, what's the only way we've learned how to factor something with 3 terms? Bottoms up, A times C. So let's do that. So A is 1 times C is negative 9. So what times what is negative 9? But those same 2 numbers add up to 8 in the middle.
9 negative 1.
Negative 9. No, positive 9. Minus 1, right? Now, what's the only difference between breaking an x squared apart? Because usually when we do bottoms up, it's x squared. But this is an x to the 4th. Now, we did this earlier this year. This isn't new. What are we going to break it apart into?
X squared plus.
Yeah, if this is a 4, we have to do x squared and x squared. That's the only difference. Okay, now, this here is a difference of squares. So 1 plus, 1 minus, x times x, 1 times 1. But how do we factor a sum of squares? You got to put the I in it, okay? So plus 9 is x plus 3i, x minus 3i. So if there is a sum, that's always going to be imaginary factors. So what's our answer out of this factor?
1.
1. What's our factor out of this factor?
-1.
-1. Now we can still do it with this. So if I have x minus 3i equals 0, you just add over 3i. So therefore x equals 3i. So here we have x equals positive 3i. This here would give us negative 3i. So how many answers did we get? 4. How many are real?
2.
How many are imaginary?
2.
So how many actual x-intercepts do we have?
2.
The 2 real ones, yeah. Now, would we have gotten the same answer if I didn't break this apart into a imaginary factor?
Yeah.
Because watch, x squared plus 9, if I just set that straight equal to 0, we would subtract over the 9, right? Then we would square root plus or minus, and square root of 9 is
3.
3i. So we still get the same thing, plus or minus 3i out of that factor. Okay, now if you're watching the video, go ahead and pause it and do 3 and 4 on your own, and then you guys go and do 3 and 4 on your own, and I'll go over here in a minute. What's the GCF of the second half?
-2.
Yeah, you have to factor out a -2, so that makes the x positive and the 3 negative. So you can see a negative times a negative is a positive, so it changes that sign. Remember, the whole concept of grouping is we want this factor to be the same as this factor. So the x minus 3 comes out front, and then what's going to be the other factor if we take those away? X squared minus 2. And at this point, does x squared minus 2 break apart any further? Yeah, it doesn't factor any further because 2 is not a perfect square. So we just go straight to setting them equal to 0. So obviously this one's going to be positive 3. X squared minus 2 equals 0. Add the 2 over. You get plus or minus the square root of 2.
Yeah.
So how many answers do we get?
Got 3.
3. How many of them were real?
3.
All 3 of them. Yeah, we didn't get any I that time.
Skylar Piles.
So there's the answer to number 4. You can see, follow along the steps and pause if you need to. But all 4 answers are imaginary. So we have plus or minus I squared of 6, and we have plus or minus I. So that tells us that this polynomial will never cross the x-axis.